It was a bright spring morning in downtown Boston when Mrs. Chen walked into Lux & Co., one of those fancy stores where even the air feels expensive. She wasn't dressed for shopping at such a high-end place, just wearing her comfortable weekend clothes, a pair of well-loved jeans, and a simple blue blouse. But after working 60-hour weeks as a banking executive, she'd had earned the right to dress however she wanted on her days off. Today was special. Her daughter was graduating from medical school next month, and Mrs. Chen wanted to find the perfect gift. She had worked her way up from a bank teller to becoming a regional director and part owner of one of the largest banks in the Northeast. Every step of that journey had been challenging, but watching her daughter follow her dreams made it all worthwhile. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors of the store, she noticed how the security guard's eyes followed her a bit too closely. She was used to it by now, that subtle scrutiny that came with being an Asian woman in spaces where people didn't expect to see her. The store was quietly busy, with soft classical music playing in the background and the kind of lighting that made everything sparkle just a bit more than necessary. A group of shoppers chatted near the jewelry counter, their laughter mixing with the gentle clink of expensive watches being shown to them by an enthusiastic salesperson. Mrs. Chen couldn't help but notice how the same salesperson's smile dimmed slightly when they glanced in her direction. She took her time, walking past displays of designer bags and accessories. Her fingers traced the edge of a glass showcase as she remembered how her own mother used to window shop at places like this, dreaming of the day she could buy something special for her children. Now here she was, about to spend thousands on a graduation gift, living the dream her parents had when they first immigrated to America. The store's atmosphere was thick with perfume and privilege, but Mrs. Chen moved through it with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in the world. She knew exactly what she was looking for, a watch she had spotted in the store's online catalog. Something elegant, but not flashy, expensive, but worth every penny. The kind of gift that said, "I'm proud of you" in every tick of its hands. What she didn't know was that this simple shopping trip was about to turn into something much bigger. As she approached the counter where two sales clerks were chatting about their weekend plans, neither bothering to acknowledge her presence, Mrs. Chen had no idea she was about to become the center of a story that would spark conversations across the country. She stood there patiently, her platinum credit card ready in her hand. The weight of that card reminded her of all the meetings, late nights, and tough decisions that had led to her success. If only the young clerk, who was now reluctantly ending her conversation about beach plans, knew who was really standing in front of her. But sometimes, Mrs. Chen thought, the best lessons in life come when we least expect them. The morning sunlight streamed through the store's windows, catching the diamonds in the display cases and sending little rainbows dancing across the walls. It was beautiful, really. Almost as beautiful as the lesson in humility and prejudice that was about to unfold in this temple of luxury. Mrs. Chen moved through the store's gleaming aisles with purpose, her eyes scanning the displays of luxury watches. Each step was measured, deliberate, as she thought about her daughter's upcoming graduation. 24 years of memories flashed through her mind. First steps, first words, first day of school, and now, finally, becoming a doctor. Every sacrifice had been worth it. The watch section was tucked away in a corner, bathed in special lighting that made each timepiece look like a small treasure. Different shapes and sizes caught the light, some studded with diamonds, others sleek and modern. Mrs. Chen knew exactly what she was looking for, something classic that would last a lifetime, just like the pride she felt in her daughter's achievements. A young sales clerk, Ms. Thompson, was arranging displays nearby, carefully avoiding eye contact. She glanced at Mrs. Chen several times, but seemed more interested in rearranging already perfect displays than offering assistance. It was a familiar dance, the subtle avoidance, the pretend business, the silent judgment of whether someone belonged in a store where watches cost more than some people's monthly rent. "Excuse me," Mrs. Chen said softly, her voice carrying the warmth and authority that had earned her respect in countless boardrooms. "I'd like to see that one, please." She pointed to a beautiful silver and gold watch with a mother-of-pearl face. The price tag read $3,800. But Mrs. Chen didn't flinch. She'd worked too hard to hesitate over spending money she'd rightfully earned. Miss Thompson's response was barely audible, a mumbled "just a moment," as she slowly made her way to the display case. Her body language spoke volumes, the slight eye roll, the dragging feet, the way she held herself as if helping was beneath her. Another sales clerk watched from behind the counter, whispering something to her colleague that made them both smirk. The watch, when finally presented, was even more beautiful up close. Mrs. Chen examined it carefully, thinking about how it would look on her daughter's wrist during long hospital shifts. The second hand moved smoothly around the face, marking time in the same steady way her daughter had moved toward her dreams. One moment, one study session, one exam at a time. "It's perfect," Mrs. Chen said, reaching into her simple leather purse. "I'll take it." She could feel the shift in the air as she pulled out her platinum credit card. The whispers behind the counter grew slightly louder, and Miss Thompson's eyebrows rose just a fraction of an inch. The card caught the light, its metallic surface reflecting the store's expensive lighting. What happened next would become a story told in break rooms and boardrooms across the city. As Mrs. Chen held out her card, she noticed something in Miss Thompson's eyes. A mix of suspicion and something else, something harder and colder. The young clerk's hand moved toward the card, but instead of reaching for the card reader, she reached for something else on the counter. The other customers browsing nearby had no idea they were about to witness something that would change not just one person's life, but the way an entire company thought about customer service and human dignity. Mrs. Chen stood tall, her hands steady, unaware that in the next few moments, her quiet shopping trip would transform into a powerful lesson about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of wealth. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, and somewhere in the store, a phone rang unanswered. The moment hung suspended, like a drop of water just before it falls, waiting for gravity to take hold. And then, everything changed. The moment seemed to stretch like taffy as Miss Thompson reached for the scissors on the counter. Her movement was quick and deliberate, a flash of silver in the store's carefully designed lighting. "We don't accept fake cards here," she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the showroom floor. Without even attempting to run the card through the machine, she began to cut. The sound of metal slicing through plastic echoed in Mrs. Chen's ears. It wasn't just a credit card being destroyed. It was a blatant display of prejudice, happening right there in broad daylight. Other customers stopped browsing and turned to watch, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Mrs. Chen's hands remained steady, even as she watched pieces of her platinum card fall onto the glassed counter like expensive confetti. Years of facing discrimination had taught her something valuable. Sometimes the most powerful response is calm dignity. She took a deep breath, the same way she did before major presentations in the boardroom. "That's interesting," Mrs. Chen said, her voice clear and controlled. "Did you know that cutting up someone's credit card without verification is against banking regulations?" The store had gone eerily quiet now, the background music suddenly seeming too cheerful for the moment. Even the other sales clerk had stopped smirking, sensing that something was very, very wrong. Ms. Thompson's confidence wavered slightly, but she doubled down. "Well, someone like you couldn't possibly have a real platinum card," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Someone in the back of the store muttered, "Oh my God, did she really just say that?" With the same deliberate calm she used in million-dollar negotiations, Mrs. Chen opened her purse again. This time, she pulled out two things: her business card and her driver's license. She placed them carefully on the counter, right next to the destroyed credit card. The business card gleamed with the bank's familiar logo, the same bank that issued the card now lying in pieces. I'm the regional director and part owner of First Metropolitan Bank, Mrs. Chen stated, her voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. The bank that issues these fake cards you're so concerned about. The color drained from Ms. Thompson's face so quickly, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. The other sales clerk's hand flew to her mouth. Phones were recording everywhere now, capturing the moment when realization dawned on the young clerk's face. The security guard, who had watched Mrs. Chen so carefully when she entered, suddenly found the floor very interesting to look at. The store manager, alerted by the unusual silence, emerged from his office. He took in the scene, the cut-up credit card, the business card displaying Mrs. Chen's position, and his employee's rapidly paling face. "What's going on here?" he asked, but the tremble in his voice suggested he already knew this was a disaster in the making. Mrs. Chen turned to face him, her posture straight and dignified. 2 decades of breaking through glass ceilings had prepared her for moments like this. She wasn't angry. She was determined. This wasn't just about a ruined credit card or a denied purchase. This was about every person who'd ever been judged by their appearance. Every assumption made about someone's worth based on how they looked. The morning light continued to stream through the store's windows, but now it felt like a spotlight on a stage where an important story was about to unfold. A story about prejudice, power, and the possibility of turning an ugly moment into something meaningful. The destroyed credit card lay on the counter between them, no longer just plastic and metal, but a symbol of something much bigger about to begin. The store manager's hands were shaking as he scrambled to pull up a chair for Mrs. Chen. Please sit down," he stammered, shooting desperate glances at the growing crowd of customers. "Let me get you some water." But Mrs. Chen remained standing, her presence somehow making her seem taller than her actual height. "What I'd like," she said calmly, "is the contact information for your corporate office." Her voice was steady, professional, the same voice she used when handling major banking crises. The manager nodded frantically, nearly tripping over himself as he rushed to his office. Miss Thompson stood frozen behind the counter, still holding the scissors, looking like she wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. A well-dressed elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers. "I saw everything," she announced, her voice quivering with anger. "I've been shopping here for 20 years, but I never thought I'd see such disgraceful behavior." Others began to speak up too, their phones still recording. The incident was probably already spreading across social media like wildfire. Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Mr. Wu?" "Yes, it's me. I'm going to need a replacement card immediately." She paused, listening. "No, my card wasn't lost or stolen. It was just cut up by a sales clerk who decided I couldn't possibly be its rightful owner." The person on the other end of the line went silent for a moment before erupting into shocked exclamations. The store manager returned, clutching a business card and a bottle of water like life preservers. "Here's our corporate contact information," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And our regional VP's direct line. Please, Mrs. Chen, I can't apologize enough for this terrible incident." Several customers had gathered around Mrs. Chen, sharing their own stories of being judged or dismissed in high-end stores. A young professional woman wiped tears from her eyes as she described being followed around shops, assumed to be a shoplifter rather than a customer. An elderly gentleman in a casual sweater talked about being ignored until he mentioned he was a retired judge. Mrs. Chen listened to each story, her expression thoughtful. This moment was bigger than her now. It had become a catalyst for all the unspoken experiences people carried with them. The destroyed credit card still lay on the counter, its pieces reflecting the store's elegant lighting, now seeming more like evidence than debris. A young intern from the local news station, who happened to be shopping during her lunch break, approached carefully. "Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to share your story? People need to hear about this." Other customers nodded in agreement, some still recording on their phones, others typing rapidly on social media. The store's atmosphere had completely transformed. The soft background music now seemed jarringly inappropriate. The luxury items in their gleaming cases appeared less impressive, overshadowed by the human drama unfolding in their midst. Miss Thompson had retreated to a corner, being quietly but sternly addressed by another manager who had rushed in from a different department. Mrs. Chen looked at the watch she had wanted to buy for her daughter, still sitting in its display case, witnessing everything. In that moment, she made a decision. This wouldn't be just another viral video of bad behavior. She would turn this humiliating experience into something meaningful, something that might help prevent others from facing similar treatment. She turned to face the crowd, her voice clear and purposeful. "I think," she said, "it's time we had a larger conversation about how we see and treat each other." The room fell silent, waiting for her next words. In that moment, everyone knew they were witnessing something important. Not just the exposure of prejudice, but the beginning of a movement for change. Within hours, the story exploded across social media. Videos of the incident, filmed by concerned customers, spread rapidly. Comment sections filled with thousands of similar stories, creating a wave of shared experiences that couldn't be ignored. The luxury store's phone lines were ringing nonstop, and their social media accounts were flooded with messages. Mrs. Chen sat in her home office that evening, watching her phone light up with notifications. News outlets were calling, seeking interviews. Her email inbox was overflowing with messages of support from people across the country. Even her daughter called from medical school, worried and proud at the same time. "Mom, you're trending on social media," she said, her voice a mix of concern and amazement. The store's corporate office responded quickly, perhaps too quickly. Their first statement felt rushed and generic. "We deeply regret the incident and are investigating the matter." The public wasn't satisfied. Comments poured in. "Not good enough. What about actual change? We need more than empty words." Mrs. Chen's colleagues at the bank rallied around her. The CEO himself called, expressing not just support, but asking for her guidance. "We need to do better," he admitted. "What can we do to prevent this from happening to others?" It was the question Mrs. Chen had been waiting for. As she sat at her kitchen table that evening, sipping tea and reading through messages, Mrs. Chen thought about all the times she'd stayed quiet in the face of discrimination. All the times she'd swallowed her pride and moved on. Not this time. This time would be different. Her phone buzzed again. It was the store's regional VP, practically begging for a meeting. "Please," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "help us make this right." Mrs. Chen agreed to meet, but on one condition. This wouldn't be just about apologies. It would be about real, lasting change. The next morning, Mrs. Chen walked into her bank's main office wearing the same casual clothes she'd worn to the store. Her employees greeted her with newfound admiration. A young teller, fighting back tears, thanked her for standing up. "My mother faced the same thing last month," she whispered, but she was too afraid to say anything. Social media continued to buzz. The hashtag Respect for All was trending, with people sharing their own stories of prejudice in retail settings. A popular morning show wanted to interview Mrs. Chen. Business magazines were calling it a watershed moment for retail customer service. But Mrs. Chen had bigger plans than just television appearances. She pulled out a notebook and began to write. Years of banking experience had taught her that real change requires concrete action. She drafted a plan: comprehensive training programs, clear accountability measures, regular audits of customer service interactions. This wouldn't just be about sensitivity training. It would be about transforming how businesses think about customer service. A group of retail workers started an online petition, sharing their own perspectives on witnessing discrimination but feeling powerless to stop it. The petition gathered thousands of signatures within hours. Mrs. Chen read their stories, each one reinforcing her determination to create meaningful change. Late that evening, as she finally checked the last email, Mrs. Chen found a message from an unexpected source. It was from Ms. Thompson, the clerk who had cut her card. The message was simple but sincere. I'm sorry. I want to learn. I want to be part of the solution. Mrs. Chen sat back in her chair, thinking carefully about her response. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with the smallest steps. The meeting room at the store's corporate headquarters was tense. Executives in expensive suits shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as Mrs. Chen walked in, dressed professionally but simply. She carried a thick folder filled with printed emails, social media comments, and her carefully drafted proposal for change. Before we begin, Mrs. Chen said, placing the folder on the polished conference table, I want you to hear something. She pulled out her tablet and played a video compilation. It showed dozens of people sharing their stories of discrimination in stores across the country. The executives watched in silence, their faces growing more concerned with each testimony. These aren't just isolated incidents, Mrs. Chen explained, her voice firm but understanding. This is happening every day, in stores everywhere. The only difference is that most people don't have the platform to speak up. She opened her folder and began laying out printed pages, each one a story, a complaint, a plea for dignity. The company's CEO leaned forward, his expression serious. What do you suggest we do? He asked. It wasn't just a polite question. There was genuine concern in his voice. The incident had already cost them millions in canceled orders and damaged reputation. But Mrs. Chen wasn't interested in their bottom line. We need to do more than just apologize, she said, pulling out her detailed proposal. We need to create real change. Her plan was comprehensive. Mandatory training programs, mystery shoppers from diverse backgrounds, regular customer service audits, and a new company policy that put respect at the forefront of every interaction. The room buzzed with discussion as she outlined each point. Some executives took furious notes, others nodded in agreement. One older board member wiped away tears as he shared how his own daughter had faced similar treatment at other stores. The human cost of discrimination was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed. Another message from Ms. Thompson. The young clerk had been suspended pending investigation, but instead of being bitter, she had started organizing discussion groups with other retail workers about unconscious bias. Sometimes, Mrs. Chen told the executives, our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest learning opportunities. The meeting lasted for hours. By the end, the company had committed to implementing every single one of Mrs. Chen's recommendations. But she wasn't finished. This can't just be about one store or one company, she insisted. We need to make this an industry standard. The CEO nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He picked up his phone and called the heads of 3 other major retail chains. Put them on speakerphone. We need to talk about changing our industry, he said. And I have someone here you need to listen to. As Mrs. Chen began sharing her vision with these industry leaders, she thought about her daughter graduating medical school soon. How different would the world be for her? Would she walk into stores without being judged? Would she be treated with the respect she deserved? The sun was setting by the time the meeting ended. Plans were in motion for a nationwide retail initiative on customer respect and diversity. Major companies were signing on, committed to making real changes. News outlets were already picking up the story, not just about the incident anymore, but about the positive changes it was sparking. Walking to her car, Mrs. Chen remembered the watch she had wanted to buy for her daughter. She smiled, thinking how this turned out to be a much more valuable graduation gift. A lesson about standing up for what's right, about turning negative experiences into positive change, about the power of one person to make a difference. 3 months had passed since the incident. The luxury store's training room was full, with employees from various branches sitting in rows, listening intently. At the front of the room stood Ms. Thompson, sharing her story openly and honestly. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice was clear and determined. I never thought I was prejudiced, she admitted to the room. But that day showed me how wrong I was. How many assumptions I was making without even realizing it. The room was silent, every person there understanding the weight of her words. Some nodded, recognizing their own biases in her story. Mrs. Chen sat quietly in the back of the room, watching the training session unfold. The program she had helped develop was now in its third month. It wasn't just about diversity. It was about understanding, about seeing people as people, not as stereotypes or assumptions. A retail worker raised his hand. Sometimes I catch myself making quick judgments about customers, he confessed. How do I stop that? His honesty opened a flood of similar questions from others. The discussion that followed was raw, real, and exactly what Mrs. Chen had hoped for when she designed this program. During the lunch break, employees shared their own experiences, both as workers and as customers. A security guard talked about the guilt he felt for following certain customers around the store. A cashier admitted to treating people differently based on how they dressed. The walls of silence were coming down, one honest conversation at a time. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Role-playing exercises helped staff understand how their actions affected customers. They practiced handling different situations, learning to treat everyone with the same level of respect and service. The energy in the room was different now. People were engaged, eager to learn, wanting to do better. Ms. Thompson approached Mrs. Chen during a break. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. "You could have had me fired, could have sued the store. Instead, you helped create something that's changing lives." Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering the angry, defensive young woman from 3 months ago. The change in her was remarkable. The training program had spread beyond just one store. 5 other major retail chains had adopted it, with more joining every month. News outlets were reporting a significant drop in customer complaints about discrimination. Small businesses were reaching out, asking how they could implement similar training. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Chen visited the store where it all began. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Staff greeted every customer warmly, regardless of appearance. The security guards stood alert but friendly, no longer profiling shoppers. Even the way employees carried themselves had changed, more confident, more professional, more aware. She walked to the watch counter, where a new display had been set up. Next to the luxury timepieces was a framed message. "Every person who walks through our doors deserves respect, dignity, and excellent service. This is our promise to you." It wasn't just words on a wall. The staff was living it. Mrs. Chen thought about how one horrible moment had turned into something powerful. The training sessions weren't just changing retail workers, they were changing lives. People were talking about their experiences, confronting their biases, and learning to see each other differently. Real change was happening, one person, one store, one honest conversation at a time. 6 months after the incident, Mrs. Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the National Retail Federation's annual convention. The crowd included store owners, managers, and employees from across the country. They weren't just there to listen. They were there to learn and change. "When my credit card was cut up that day," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I had 2 choices. I could let anger take over, or I could channel that moment into something meaningful." The audience sat in rapt attention, many recording her speech on their phones, others taking rapid notes. She shared stories from the past 6 months, not just her own, but those of others who had reached out to her. A teenage boy who was finally treated with respect while shopping for his prom suit. An elderly woman who no longer felt invisible when she walked into high-end stores. A young professional who didn't have to prove her ability to pay before being shown expensive items. The statistics were impressive. Customer complaints about discrimination had dropped by 60% in stores that adopted the training program. Employee satisfaction rates were up. Even sales had increased, proving that treating people with respect was good for business. But Mrs. Chen wasn't there to talk about profits. The real change, she explained, showing slides of training sessions. Happens in moments like these. The screen displayed images of employees sharing stories, role-playing scenarios, learning to recognize and overcome their biases. It happens when we stop seeing customers as stereotypes and start seeing them as people. In the middle of her presentation, she did something unexpected. She asked everyone to close their eyes. "Think about a time when you felt judged," she said softly. "Remember how it felt. Now, open your eyes and look around. Every person in this room has felt that way at some point. That's why this matters." The store manager from the original incident stood up to share his perspective. He talked about how the training had transformed not just his store, but his own way of thinking. His voice cracked as he described watching his employees grow and change, becoming not just better workers, but better people. A retail worker from a small town spoke next, describing how she had brought the training principles to her community. "It's not just about big cities or luxury stores," she explained. "This is about how we treat each other everywhere, every day." Her simple words resonated through the room, drawing nods of agreement. Mrs. Chen unveiled the next phase of the program, a nationwide certification for stores that completed the training and maintained high standards of customer respect. The certificate wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a promise to customers that they would be treated with dignity, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. During the question and answer session, hands shot up across the auditorium. People weren't just asking about implementing the program. They were sharing their own stories, their own commitments to change. The conversation had grown beyond one incident in one store. It had become a movement. As the session ended, Mrs. Chen noticed a young retail worker lingering near the stage. "Your story changed how I see people," she said quietly. "Now, when someone walks into my store, I remember your words. I'd remember to see the person, not my assumptions." Mrs. Chen hugged her, understanding that real change happens one heart at a time. 1 year had passed. Mrs. Chen stood in front of her daughter's medical school graduation ceremony, watching with pride as hundreds of new doctors received their diplomas. The watch she had eventually bought her daughter gleamed on her wrist, not just a timepiece now, but a symbol of something much larger. After the ceremony, a young store employee approached them. She had recognized Mrs. Chen from the training videos. "Your story changed our whole industry," she said excitedly. "I just wanted to thank you." Mrs. Chen's daughter squeezed her mother's hand, proud of how her mom had turned a moment of humiliation into a force for change. The numbers told an impressive story. Over 500 stores nationwide had completed the training program. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs. But the real success wasn't in the statistics. It was in the everyday moments that no one counted. The warm welcomes that replaced suspicious glances. The respectful service that replaced assumptions. Back at her bank office, Mrs. Chen looked through the latest batch of letters. They came from everywhere. Small towns, big cities, different countries even. Each one told a story of change. A luxury car dealership that had transformed its sales approach. A jewelry store that had doubled its business by treating everyone like a valued customer. A department store where former complainants had become regular customers. Ms. Thompson, the clerk who had cut her card a year ago, had been promoted to training coordinator. She traveled to different stores, sharing her story and helping others confront their own biases. Her journey from that moment of prejudice to becoming an advocate for change inspired others to face their own prejudices honestly. The Retail Industry magazine had named Mrs. Chen Change Maker of the Year. But she knew the real change makers were the thousands of retail workers who chose to do better every day. The security guards who stopped profiling customers. The sales clerks who offered the same service to everyone. The managers who made respect a priority. At a coffee shop near her office, Mrs. Chen overheard two retail workers talking about their day. "Remember what we learned in training," one said to the other. "You never know someone's story." She smiled, remembering how different things were just a year ago. The training program had evolved, too. It now included sections on cultural awareness, disability rights, and age discrimination. Store employees learned about different cultural traditions, religious practices, and how to make every customer feel welcomed and respected. Mrs. Chen's daughter, now Dr. Chen, shared stories from her hospital rounds. "Mom, your training program is helping there too," she explained. "The hospital administrators saw your videos and started similar training for medical staff. They're learning to treat all patients with the same respect." Looking back at the cut-up credit card, which she had kept as a reminder, Mrs. Chen thought about how one small moment could spark such big changes. The card pieces were now framed in her office, next to photos of smiling retail workers graduating from the training program, letters of thanks, and news articles about the industry's transformation. The last lines of her upcoming keynote speech summed it up perfectly. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or big plans. Sometimes it comes from standing up in small moments, from turning pain into purpose, from believing that every person deserves respect. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with one person saying enough and another person listening and learning. That's how we build a better world. One interaction, one person, one moment at a time.